Good afternoon, and I'm super excited to invite Anthony on today. So just as a bit of a recap, the Resilient Growth Playbook is our series following the thousands of people that watched the Sustainable Growth series, and what we really want to do is talk to founders and business leaders about how to grow businesses, B2B and B2C, where we're not just relying on a lot of paid media and venture funding to keep scaling, but actually to think about how do we create marketing systems that can generate revenue early days, how can we build brands that attract and retain loyal customers and create that self-sustaining loop where we build good customers who then attract the next, and just thinking about what those smart decisions are. So excited to introduce Anthony onto here. So we've worked with Harbr for the last year as marketing partner, so very familiar there. And rather than me telling you about your past and all your experience so far, Anthony, I'd love you just to start by talking about how you got to where you are today. What was your first job, and where did it go from there?
Smashing. So yeah, it's been a bit of a journey. So my first job was UK government, working for the Ministry of Defence. So I was effectively an analyst. So looking at lots of different information and trying to work out sort of what was happening and kind of work out what we should do next. After that, I joined HSBC and I started managing global information security programs. And that was at a time when everyone was sort of leaving CDs and files on trains and things like that. So that ended up being quite sort of physical orientated. And then kind of with the rise of kind of internet and connectivity and cyber attacks, that increasingly became a lot more digital. I then built a data platform and a analytics function to look for kind of large wholesale banking fraud events. So that was on the back of Bernie Madoff and Parmalat and a few other sort of large corporate kind of fraud scandals. And then after that, I built a large function and a bigger data platform as part of an initiative called the Financial Intelligence Unit, which was HSBC's attempt to identify and manage complex financial crime that was happening kind of within its banking book globally. Having done that, I kind of came across a bunch of problems around the scalability of data platforms, how tricky it can be to get data into them, how tricky it can be for users to get kind of data and insights out of them, particularly when the data was coming from lots of different places and needed to go to different places. So effectively, what do you do when you have data silos because of lines of business, use cases, jurisdictions, or where you have diverse users who have different skills and therefore require different interfaces for interacting with the data. So I left HSBC in 2017. I started a company called Harbr Data. We've been running for the last 8.5 years. And effectively what we do is we build what we call private data marketplace platforms. So imagine secure, collaborative data exchanges that work within and between organizations and help lots of different people be able to find, access and use the data that they need to be effective in their jobs. Whilst I've been doing that in parallel, we also built out a synthetic data set to help train kind of financial crime systems, so the models that are within them, to detect financial crime, which is very, very challenging because typically you don't have a strong feedback loop mechanism, and the data, certainly the historic data and the data around people that you suspected of financial crime is extremely sensitive. So it's a kind of low risk, low bias and very kind of feature rich feedback loop mechanism for those models. So, and now I run both of those in parallel, founder in one and running the other.
Incredible. And how do you think because you started off obviously in government and a very different way of working, I'm sure, than as an entrepreneur, but you're sort of early studying politics and being in government. How do you think that actually helped you when you got into entrepreneurship with sort of diplomacy and negotiation and measuring risk?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's some significant differences between I think working in government and working in let's say the private sector, but kind of any sort of commercial role. In the private sector, there's always a bottom line. So everything effectively comes down to a cost or a revenue item ultimately, and that's usually how you're measured. Occasionally there are things that are difficult to measure. So like brand can be really difficult to measure in terms of its value. Has it become more or less valuable as a result of something you've done? That's trickier to measure. But most things you can measure fairly well. In government, that's far more challenging because typically it's not for profit. So you end up with proxies for what is a good or a bad job, and a lot of those tend to be, I would say, more similar to trying to assess the value of a brand. So they're quite different, and I think with the lack of a clear number in government, kind of politics and diplomacy and other things are a bit more challenging, and they just happen a bit more because it's a bit less clear, a bit more open to opinion, a bit more subjective, whereas in the private sector, kind of less so. That said, working in a very large organisation is super challenging. And I think there inevitably there's boardroom politics and other challenges. So certainly the private sector is not without its politics, but yeah, the fact it has a bottom line usually helps as an arbiter for that.
As a good reason of yes and as a yes or no answer, I suppose. And as you've grown Harbr, have you found that you've needed to understand how to measure the value of the brand?
So I think as a startup, the idea of measuring the value of the brand it feels almost like a bit of a luxury, to be honest. You have so many jobs that you need to be doing every minute of every day, that kind of taking a step back and thinking about, well, how am I going to measure it, and what methodology am I going to do, and then going ahead and doing it, and then probably doing it again so that you get some kind of trend and a sense of what's happening. I would say that generally that's not the highest priority. It kind of feels like the highest priority is kind of getting things, this is going to sound wrong, but like getting things done that are going to impact the bottom line, as opposed to kind of getting some sort of sense or measurement as to the value of your brand in general. That said, there are obviously a lot of metrics that you are going to measure, which are pretty objective, that are going to give you a feel for whether your brand is resonating or not. Like, they're not perfect, but they're like reasonable proxies. And that'd be things like, very objective measures like number of leads coming in, is that going up or down, amount of traffic, your SEO rankings, they're pretty objective. There's some slightly more subjective ones, so people saying things to you like, wow, you guys seem to be doing really well, or I love your brand, or whatever. So, I think you can kind of gather those and sort of get a general sense of like, are we doing a good job or not?
Yeah, and I definitely think it's so much harder when it's high value, long sales times. It's not as easy because you're just not going to have those numbers. It's quantitatively, it's just not as accurate to measure.
Yeah.
But I also think at the beginning, in the early days of Harbr, it would have been as much about your personal brand and the experience of your team, as to why people should trust Harbr to build, versus any sort of classic brand measurement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this was, I was sort of a bit surprised by this and continue to be surprised for far too long by this. I think people like stories. I like stories. Most people I encounter like stories. I think we learn a lot through stories. And I think the founding story, and often the story of the founder, like, well, why did you do this? Where did it come from? I think generally people are interested in those stories. Like most people I meet kind of will say to me like, oh, I really want to start my own business, but I'm not sure what idea I do, or I'm not brave enough, or whatever. And I think people do find those stories kind of interesting. So I think that is really important. I think the other bit that is important, which for me makes maybe a bit more sense, is that when you start a business, rightly or wrongly, if you encounter the founder of a business, then you expect that person is going to be able to get things done and make things happen. And if you trust them, then that's kind of half the battle, because we sell to very large companies with really complicated, what we call data ecosystems. So lots of different organizations interacting with each other, sharing data, collaborating on data. And that's quite sensitive. And those large companies would typically interact with other large companies. So I think that kind of, can I trust this small company, often boils down to, can I trust the founder of this company? Because it's never a smooth journey, ever, with software, particularly enterprise software. And it does need to be a partnership, and that requires trust. So I think those two aspects, the sort of interest in the founding story, but also that, do I trust this person, and am I going to, put my career on the line to use that technology? I think those two things are really important, and arguably, as you said, far more important than, I like the look of that logo, to take something very trite,
Yeah, definitely. And I think that you just touched on something around, it's also the reputation of the person that's going to push that through in the business. It's their reputation that's at stake. So how are we going to make them feel comfortable and confident that they're making the right decision, they're investing their time and reputation in the right things?
Absolutely.
As much as the budget or the timing or when to expect.
Yeah.
And I suppose going back to sort of how to balance security and innovation, because I think you must have seen this throughout your career, definitely from government to big banks to now working on the other side, as it were. But it feels like that is the tension playing out at the moment. We see this across all of data, all of AI, anything where we're looking at software innovation, that which do they want, what do they feel more? Is it about speed? Is it about quality? Is it about cost? How do you play and make sure that you're building that confidence to know that we are innovative and we are going to be going ahead of the crowd, because that's where you want to buy from us, but also we've made sure that all of your data is safe, and we're not going to let anything, we understand this is business critical and it's the basis of what we do.
Yeah, I think for us, it's interesting how you've kind of characterised it there, where it's sort of almost like two ends of the spectrum, and you kind of invest in one or the other. I think broadly that's true. I think there are some nice, happy situations where it's not a trade-off, and it's literally like, this is absolutely right, and it covers both parts equally well. For us, certainly coming out of HSBC, which I did and several of the early members of the team did, and the others often were coming out of large corporates as well. So our makeup as a startup team, our DNA was quite large corporate security, with a very high expectation around what security should look like. So I think, if I were to look back and be self-critical, I think we almost overcooked the security bit at the start, and we actually had to unpick various decisions that we had made, where we had sort of forced the users to be as secure as possible. We didn't really give them an option to be less secure, and sometimes less secure was fine. It was secure enough, and that was okay. So I think we probably overbaked it a bit at the start, and then it's kind of just finding the right balance between making sure that what you set out was your position and your standards, whether that's in policy or your sales material or just your culture, that is like correct, and that isn't changing, because I think that starts to erode trust, and then sort of over and above that, sort of where you invest, how much you invest, I think that's kind of a judgment call. Again, just going back to the earlier conversation, almost everything in risk you can ultimately turn into a number, and I think if you in your organization have the ability to do that, you can make informed decisions. Doesn't mean they're always going to be the right ones, but you can at least make informed decisions. And then I think the last thing is, security is very dynamic. Software is constantly updating, the threat landscape's constantly changing, new risks emerge regularly. You find the largest software vendors in the world have kind of 0-day vulnerabilities that are identified that have been sat there for, in some cases, many years, and may or may not have been exploited. So I think there is that. You have to accept that sometimes you're going to be on the wrong side of that, and that sometimes just events outside your control. Sometimes you just made a bad decision and you've underinvested, and I think when that happens, you just have to, put your hands up and say, we didn't do enough here. We're going to resolve it, and this is what we've done to effectively be better going forward. And I think that's just super important. Again, just going back to that conversation about trust. It needs to be a dialogue. It needs to be a conversation. You need to be transparent about it, and then you need to deal with it in the event that something unexpected happens.
Yeah, it's a massive learning curve, but I definitely agree. It's such a life lesson, isn't it? Just be a partner, be honest, hands up if something goes wrong, but always have a plan and think about. It was when I worked, my last in-house job was working with a Dutch team, and the question was always what could go wrong. Yeah. And I always, at first, it's very un-British to ask what could go wrong, but it's a very useful conversation for anything. It's all good, let's go for it, but let's have a plan in case anything does, and let's be clear on what we know might happen.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, part of it, certainly within security, is, you can do that work around, whether it's formal red teaming or pen testing or whatever, around what could go wrong. And you can have plans. Again, there's only so much you can do. And then I think it just comes down to incident management processes, which does rely on good dialogue and trust between you and your users or customers, so that in the event that something does go wrong, which it probably will at some point, you're able to manage that and remediate that swiftly and effectively.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think that brings us quite nicely on to the conversation around synthetic data, which is obviously becoming more accepted and trusted and sort of, I wouldn't say mainstream, but more understood in the last sort of 6 months or so. But you're obviously quite early on with driving, with sort of putting your work behind that. Mm-hmm. What was it that sort of convinced you early that this would be central to how businesses should handle privacy and compliance?
Yeah, so we it was the best kind of sort of product development story, in that we didn't dream it up. There was a need which we met, and then other people started asking us for the product because they had a different use case, and it kind of then went through word of mouth, which is like absolutely ideal because the demand's there. You find out the use cases in a very immediate way, and you start, the market effectively tells you what your product is good and what it's there for. We could have been locked in a room for 30 years and not come up with those ideas. So that was very nice and very fortuitous. But effectively, in my mind, there's a couple of different use cases for synthetic data. Sometimes it's just a straightforward differential privacy option where I can't use the real data because it has some sensitivity to it. So I need something that sort of broadly looks and feels the same. The second is the data that I have doesn't contain the thing that I need. So that might be just you're looking for a particular phenomenon that doesn't happen frequently, and it's not there. So how can you use that? And here we're starting to go into kind of model development and model training as opposed to volumetric testing, which you might do with the former example. And then the last is usually around just scale. Particularly now with AI and LLMs, sort of, there's some good examples of synthetic data usage within autonomous vehicles. And it's like, well, I could get a camera and drive 1 million miles and feed that in, or I could synthetically generate 1 million miles worth of travel data and feed that in, and one of those is going to be fast and cheap and effective, and one of them is not. So I think volume is there as well. And with Syntheticr, the really interesting thing is it happens to be all three at the same time, which is really nice. So the data that you'd usually use to train a financial crime model is subject to regulations that make it extremely sensitive. Most banks are only seeing a part of the picture, and they don't necessarily know whether Lucy was or wasn't laundering money, and it's a really, really long wait to actually find out and confirm that she was. But just there's no confirmation that she wasn't necessarily. And then kind of the volume associated with that is usually quite limited as well, just by the footprint of that bank also. So we're able to effectively generate years and years of completely risk-free data with huge amounts of financial crime methodologies woven into it, and to be able to dynamically update and change things very quickly. So as a training mechanism for algorithms, it's really, really optimized. And that's just a product of that particular use case. You know, the same wouldn't be true of, I don't know, SEO optimization data, for example.
Yeah, and we've been testing synthetic personas. So as we do our the insight work, can we just create synthetic personas and therefore not need to go out to interview 20 people?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the results so far is, if you're a FMCG and you've got millions of customers, you've got loads of data to build them, it's very easy. The more niche you get, the less reliable it is, and therefore how useful is it if it's only 60% correct versus 100%, you know, well, as we're building brands. But it's such an interesting, we're at such an interesting time at this, I think. And as we're, so over the last year, we've seen how much sort of thought goes into that resilience over growth at all costs, and not just going, right, let's splash Harbr everywhere, let's tell everyone that this is right for you, and just prioritise speed over resilience.
Mm-hmm.
But where do you think people, especially on B2B, on similar businesses to yours, so enterprise software, where do you think other businesses do trip up when they do prioritise that speed over building a business that's going to last, and customer relationships that are going to last?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, for me, you know, we've been doing Harbr for 8.5 years, and during that time, which I think is like it's crucial to understand the context. You know, we went through from 2017 to 2020, like a significant growth period in terms of funding. And then as interest rates changed from 22, you know, well, maybe even a bit earlier actually, probably maybe kicked in around 21, you know, you started seeing a reduction in funding. And then you had this sort of sideshow that was AI funding, which has boomed and is in its own bubble right now. And then the funding started to pick up again. And I think, you know, one of the biggest mistakes to make is not understanding the market that you're in. So that growth at all costs is really important if all of your competitors are prioritising growth at all costs, and the funding is there to support that. Because that's, particularly in a software company, that's when you're going to get a category winner who usually takes the vast majority of that market, and that can be an existential risk for you. If you're in a market that's on a downward spiral, where people are not doing that, they're preserving runway, they're being really thoughtful about spend, they're trying to, you know, get to certain metrics in the most cost-efficient way, then you don't want to be out there just throwing cash and trying to be your competitor in the market, because that's not the challenge. So I think it's really important to understand the overall macro context and the competitive and funding environment that you're in as a startup in order to make the right decisions around investment. And then there's always just that other thing going on around product market fit and market timing, which I think is, I would guess, and is a complete guess, this is probably where most startups kind of get it wrong. We've got it wrong a couple of times where we thought the market was there and it wasn't yet, or we thought this bit of the market was there and that bit wasn't, but this other bit was. And that's so difficult to get right. And it's far more difficult to get right, as you said earlier, if you are kind of slow enterprise sales cycles where your feedback loop mechanism is just delayed, like really badly delayed. So that's really, really challenging. So I think those two things, sort of where are we in terms of product market fit, like our target customers, our target addressable market, our product, and those things coming together. And then what is the market doing in general? Like, I think they're really easy things to get tripped up on and get tripped up on in a way that is so significant that it's almost existential to your business, as opposed to just, I'm sort of 88% optimized on my whatever, my ad spend, instead of 94, which is like, okay, you lost a bit of money.
I think it's such a great, that reflection of always looking at yourself, not just in the bubble that you're in, because it's quite easy to get into a bubble, especially in a tech-focused business and you're focused on building, but really understanding what is that context of what's happening around you. Is that massive principle, and understanding when it is right to press the accelerator and go versus hold back. And definitely the last 4 years has been a good one of people understanding runway, I think, and elongating runway.
Yeah, and I mean, if you put those two markets side by side, if you've got a historically well-funded startup that has product market fit, but isn't doing AI, you're still in a sort of capital efficiency, preserve runway, demonstrate your metrics, grow in a more sustainable way kind of situation. If your startup is in the AI space, where there is a huge amount of funding, you do need to be driving as much growth as you possibly can, is just the reality, because if you don't, you are going to be overtaken by a competitor. Those two markets exist at the same time today, but if you're a marketing person or a GTM person or even a salesperson in either of those markets, you do need to cut your cloth accordingly and quite differently.
And what do you think for somebody that who's in a business that hasn't quite found product market fit and does need to be very conscious of budgets and runway at the moment? What would you say? What advice would you give them, especially for the marketing side of this?
Yeah, so I'm not a marketing person by trade, as you know. So most of what I've learned here is actually from working with you. And sorry, you're probably going to find this a little embarrassing, but so be it. So, I think we spent quite a bit of time, as you know, on lead gen. And we did that too early. So we were trying to kind of find and sort of encourage people to, through gated content, paid search, all that other stuff, ads, to sort of find us, capture their contact details, and then kind of nurture them. And the market timing just wasn't right for that. So, working with you guys, we shifted to more of a demand gen approach, which was really around, explaining the problem and the challenges, explaining how that could be solved, ungating our content, so really contributing to really the whole community being able to educate itself and understand it and kind of work through it, because we've got this great product that does this thing really, really well, but people get inputs from lots of different places, and everyone will be trying to sell something, and they will take their thing and sort of put a round peg in a square-shaped hole. So it's really important, I think, to help people educate themselves around what's the right tool for the right job. And once we started doing that, it was really interesting because our cost actually went down significantly. Our credibility in the market went up because people could actually see that we knew what we were talking about and we had experience in doing it, and our customers had solved these problems at scale. And then the leads that were there, they found their way to us just organically. And it was just so much more efficient. So for me, understanding that difference between demand gen and lead gen depending on where the market is and depending on the level of fit that you've got with the market, I think that's been a huge lesson for me. So that would be the one I would share.
Yeah, it goes back to that sort of the theme of our chat. Really, it's about sort of trust and credibility building, and if you can show that you know what you're talking about and you can be generous with what you can give out when the leads come, they're ready and they're asking you. They're not feeling hounded and sold to.
Yeah,
it's just a different conversation and different balance, isn't it?
Absolutely, and you don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time trying to initiate conversations with people that are 12 months away from even starting a buying journey. It's much better that they serve themselves, whether that's through content, whether that's through community, whether that's just, reading a website, whatever it happens to be. That's far more cost efficient for us as a business, and it's far more comfortable for them than really like trying to initiate conversations that they're just not ready to have. And what we've found is that when the leads do turn up, they're coming with the right questions, and the conversations are completely different. Instead of asking about basic concepts, they understand all those concepts, and what they've really honed in on but this bit. Tell me how you do this thing, because I know that that's important to me, and then we can have a really productive, really clear conversation that's just way more efficient. And if there's a fit there, great, and if there isn't, great, but we find out fast, which is really, really crucial.
Amazing. Just knowing that we're getting to time, and I need to stop asking you so many questions, what's sort of next for you in Harbr and Syntheticr, and what should we be watching out for in the next 12 months?
Yeah, so I think, with Harbr, on the back of a lot of the demand generation stuff, and I think on the back of a lot of organizations having got to a point where they've migrated a lot of data to the cloud, they've implemented a data platform, they are now creating really useful data assets or data products. We've got to the point where people understand that they need to make that very easy to discover, access, and use, because it's really the usage part where the risk starts to take effect. So you really need to govern that and control it. Whether you're selling data and insights or you're sharing them, it doesn't make a difference. It's controlling the access and usage. So that market has really turned up. It's been there for a while for organizations that sell data and insights, of which there are a growing number, which is really exciting, and I think right for the knowledge economy and now increasingly feeding AI. But also the market for sharing across kind of complex corporations and across their data ecosystems, that's also turned up. So for Harbr, we're about to launch a new website. It might be launched now, depending on when this is published and sent out. So we've kind of really invested heavily in our messaging to make that really clear. We've updated our brand and put a lot of time and effort into that. So that's come out. And for us now, it's about just growing and sort of working with as many customers as we can, because we've got all the foundational elements and we've proven success with so many of our customers already. And then on the Syntheticr side, it's an earlier stage business. We paused it for quite a while, but that's now back out into the market, and learning a lot of lessons there around demand generation, around how to build a scalable brand that's actually practically scalable in the day-to-day, and doesn't create a huge amount of overhead and resource requirements just to leverage it and utilize it. And then, sort of going out and sort of continuing to grow that business as well. So, lots of interesting times and different things going on.
Good to keep you busy. Where should people connect with you? Where's the best place to find you?
I'm on LinkedIn. Anthony Cosgrove, you can find me there, or if you want to talk about Harbr or Syntheticr in particular, you can come in via those websites and give me feedback as to whether that was good or not.
We will excitedly share the website and your LinkedIn
Perfect.
when this goes live. Thank you so much. This was a brilliant conversation. Really great talking to you. And
Thank you.
So much to learn from. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure, and I'm sure I learn more from you than you do from me. So thank you.
Never. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.